I clearly need to start this live stream over, and or I'll just edit it and post, whatever. Take out the first couple of seconds. So, ignore the first couple of seconds there. We're going to start back where we left off. Reading Yangtze, chapter 3. So, we'll begin. It says, for as long as Chinese memory reaches, the Three Gorges have inspired awe and captured imagination. We do not know when man first made his way through this spectacular and terrifying channel, but its passage was a recognized fact by the middle of the Han Dynasty. At about the time of Christ, in either direction, the Three Gorges are the highest adventure the longest river affords to travelers, and until recently the most dangerous and laborious obstacle to commerce and transport, whose practitioners wanted no adventure and were often indifferent to scenery. The ravines above Pin, where the river of golden sand plummets off the Tibet Qinghai Plateau, must be even more breathtaking. But as we have seen, this part of the river is virtually impassable, and surely the Three Gorges are enough for anyone who must traverse them on the ordinary business of the world. The natural history of the Three Gorges appears not yet to have been definitely written, although work involved with the gorge dams, the nearly finished Gejoba, and the Three Gorges Dam, which is still in the planning stage, must have required intense geological investigation. What follows, therefore, is a non-specialist stratum overlaid upon the uncertain foundations of earlier geological surveys. Observant traveler, uh, Observant travelers, as well as geologists and geographers, have long noted two remarkable phenomena associated with the Three Gorges. The first is that through this stretch the long river flows almost due east. Through the gorges there are only a few bends in the river, and these are usually offset by bends jeez, in other directions, so that the overall flow retains its pronounced linearity. Moreover, north and south of the Three Gorges, other rivers have the same linearity. The Han River to the north and the Ching River to the to the south are almost exactly parallel to this stretch of the river. The second unusual phenomenon is that nearly all the higher mountains and ridge summits near the Three Gorges, however jagged they may be, have almost identical elevations of about 3,000 feet. Furthermore, it is the most resistant limestone that reach this out that formations that reach this altitude. All the sandstone formations are lower, which strongly suggests differential erosion and weathering of a landscape originally at a more or less uniform elevation. These formations seem to be older than the Mesozoic era, more than 250 million years. Such phenomena suggests that drainage not only confined between the channeling mountain chains, but erosion across transverse formations, which would otherwise block or divert a river's flow. This cross-cutting, this cross-cutting phenomena may have been associated with drainage across a peneplain. Okay, that's a word I have to Google. This paragraph is kind of difficult to understand, so I'm pausing a little bit. Peneplain is a geomorphology and geology. The peneplain is a low relief plain formed by protracted erosion. This is the definition of the broadest terms. Albeit with frequency, their usage of a peneplain is meant to imply the representation of a near final stage of fluvial erosion during times of extended tectonic stability. Okay. I'll begin the sentence again. This cross-cutting this cross-cutting phenomena may have been associated with drainage across the peneplain, a broad area of gentle slopes itself, probably by even earlier weathering and erosion of landforms, which lay on top of deeper folded formations. As rivers established themselves on this peneplain, they eroded their way down and into or through the underlying formations that the Han and the Ching rivers share. This east-west linearity with the Long River strongly suggests a shared pattern of river formation. This same explanation applies to the tributaries in the gorge region. The most important of these is the north bank Ta Ning River, which flows nearly due south before its confluence town near the town of Wushan, at about the middle of the gorges. Despite its difference in course, the Ta Ning is so similar in structure to the Long River that its scenery often called the Small Three Gorges. Small only in the sense that the river is smaller, not that the mountains are less lofty. The cliffs less sheer. George Barber, one of the principal geological explorers of China, in his own 1935 geological study, quotes a 1907 survey, saying, "The course of the Tanning Ho is nearly at right angle to the structure of the region. It is evident that the course of the Tanning Ho across very pronounced folds um, and in spite of very marked differences among the rocks, is not one could have which could have been been acquired under existing conditions of relief. The stream could only have originated upon a surface not far from not far below the summits of the present mountains, and on a slope which sufficed to give every advantage to brooks that followed southward." Barber reasons here um, that a vein about the Long River, um, I'll say that again, I messed up. Barber reasons in like vein about the Long River, we are therefore forced to the conclusion that the present general course of the river is a latter development than the folding of the margins of the Sichuan Basin. The other debatable issue is whether or not the Long River always flowed in its present direction, that is, from west to east. Barber and J.S. Lee, perhaps China's most eminent geologists, disagreed, where Barber thought it had flowed eastward. Lee's Lee's hypothesis was more complex. He argued that about 250 million years ago, when the Sichuan Basin was part of a large inland sea, one elongated bay stretched eastward into what is now the gorge area. At this time, Li argues there may have been two rivers, one flowing westward into the Sichuan Sea, and the other eastward along something like the present middle and lower course of the Long River. Eventually, according to Lee, the sources of the two rivers joined together to form a single eastward flowing river. A recent Chinese source skirts the issue, saying, "In West Hupei, the ancient Long River began gradually to take shape and actively to extend its source back to the Sichuan Basin, and it now connected up with the Sichuan drainage system. Since the topography was now higher in the west than in the east, a mighty rolling river was formed, the Long River as we know it today. If originally there were two rivers with nearby headwaters but flowing in opposite directions, a watershed would be required. In fact, the remains of such a divide may still exist. This is the Huangling anticline, an elliptical formation of very ancient rocks, Precambrian, a billion or more years old, which straddles the Long River just a little upstream of Yichang. In Hising, in Hisling, Ling Gorge. In geologically more recent times, erosion has removed whatever originally overlay this ridge of granite in quartzite. The river has cut down through it to its present channel. In doing so, it has exposed numerous unstable layers of shale and other material which from time to time collapse in huge landslides into the river. In passing through the gorges, needs no geological knowledge to see that some places are narrower, more precipitous, and more turbulent than others. But even the observant traveler would be hard put to identify the precise starting and ending points of the principal segments into which the Chinese have traditionally divided the river. In the 8th century, the famous poet Li Po described a fast downstream trip through the gorges, saying, gone from White King, all misty-hued, down river to Ling, 1,000 li a day. From both banks monkeys' screeching sounds, behind our boat already myriad folded ranges. And it says, figure 3-1 shows the three gorges from the upstream end down. They are Tang Gorge, Wu Gorge, and Ling Gorge. For all their apparent arbitrariness, is it in a river passage so endless and consistently spectacular that the mind is eventually benumbed. These names do mean something. One often hears that Tang has the sheerest cliffs and the swiftest currents. The Witch's Gorge, or the Wu Gorge, has the most spectacular peaks and the worst whirlpools, and the Ling Gorge, the most dangerous rapids and shoals. From a structural point of view, the gorges constitute shaped valleys, while the stretches between them are broader, U-shaped valleys. Each of the gorges, indeed, each local along the river, has impressed upon centuries of boatmen and travelers its peculiar different difficulties, its historical memories, even the real or imagined similarities of rock formations to other things. The Chinese have a penchant for saying that this resembles that, but even so, like in an irregular but otherwise unremarkable outcropping of animal entrails, Horse Long's Ox Liver Gorge seems to be stretching things pretty far. The first of the gorges, Chu Tang, is also the shortest, only 5 miles long. It begins just below. Um, sorry, I should say that it shows figure 3.1 here. I'll try to. Hopefully, that's helpful to you in some way. I'm gonna look at it for a second so I can get a hang of what's going on. Okay. Sorry, my nose itches. The first of the three gorges, Shu Tang, is also the shortest, only 5 miles long. It begins just below Pai Ti Chang, the White King city of Li Po's poem. Um, as one approaches White King city from a distance, there seems no opening ahead, only a cliff-girt fjord. As one draws abreast of the little town, however, the awesome Quay Gate comes into view, requiring a right turn in order to enter the gorge itself. Nearly sheer cliffs frame this gate, where the river is a mere 350 feet wide. The narrowest point anywhere from the river leaves the mountain of the far west in full spate. Sorry. Um, Oh, I feel like I said something wrong there. Nearly sheer cliffs frame this gate, where the river is a mere 350 feet wide, the narrowest point anywhere after the river leaves the mountain, um, the mountain of the far west. Period. In full spate, the current sometimes reaches the 15 knots, but more typically 6 or 7 knots. Nearly the entrance to Chu Tong Gorge was the dangerous. Near the entrance to the Chu Tong Gorge was the dangerous Yen Yu Rock, which is now blasted away, the visible size of which depended on water levels. With centuries of experience watching Yen Yu, boatmen sang a long advisory doggerel that began. I'm going to Google what the word doggerel means. Um, Comic verse composed in an irregular rhyme. Okay. And it goes, it's like this. When you use an elephant, upstream you shan't. When you use a horse, downstream, don't downstream course. Okay. Um, Along the cliffs of the northern left bank, one can see cut into the rock face the recessed tow path, along with gangs of trackers, hauled heavily loaded junks. The boat and its cargo might be as much as 120 tons upstream against the fierce current on the south side. One has to be alert in order to see them. They pass so quickly are Mangliang's Ladder and Windbox Gorge. The former is an upward zigzag line of square holes cut into the cliffs, as sockets into which timber were inserted horizontally as rungs to climb upon. The most prominent legend, a false legend, tells of the patient valor of General Meng Liang and his troops trapped in the Windbox Gorge, and how they cut a ladder staircase to the top of the cliff, thus surprising and defeating their complacent foes. Unfortunately for the legend, the sockets run only about halfway up the cliff. More likely and less heroically, the holes were cut in order to get it at valuable herbs grown on the cliff. Windbox or Bellows Gorge takes its name from the crevices high above the river, into which the large cypress coffins were often placed vertically, creating an appearance from below resembles the segments of a bellows. Hence, the otherwise incomprehensible lines from Meng Chao's surrealistic 8th century poem, which goes like this. So, yeah, I'll say it now. Above the gorges, one thread of sky. Cascades in the gorgeous twine a thousand chords. Overhead, the slant of splintered sunlight, moonlight. Beneath cliffs curve the waves, wild heave. Tree lock, Trees lock their roots in rotted coffins and in twisted skeletons hang tilted upright. So this next section is about the Witch's Gorge or the Wu Gorge. Um, Below Chu Tong, the river widens out for a time before entering Wu Xia, just below the small town of Wushan in a small estuary valley where the Ta'aning enters the long river. Coronel Plant describes the 25 miles of the Witch's Gorge. The river winds round the base of precipitous cliffs, which rise almost perpendicular in places to 1,000 feet and more in height, and are backed here and there by lofty and fantastic peaks, walls of solid rock with strata clumped like paper set at various angles by great faults. In many parts where the strata run horizontally, these rocky wall-like sides are benched with terraces, the lower terraces being fluted along their faces by thousands of potholes bored vertically right down the water surface of the cliff to low water level, resembling somewhat the great pipes of an organ. These lofty and fantastic peaks characterize Witch's Gorge in contrast to the massive rounded crests in Chutang and the talus piles and rapids of Hsi because its steep walls and spire-like peaks block the sun during much of every day. Even in the absence of the swirling clouds, sorry, even the access and where was I? Even in the absence of swirling clouds, which so often swathe the higher elevations and overhang the river, Witch's Gorge is the most somber and foreboding of the three gorges. Here, to a degree even more pronounced than in the other two gorges, the wind blows in only two directions, upriver or downriver. Needless to say, abound boatmen always prayed and sometimes waited for a following wind. Visibility permitting, river veterans can call out the names of six peaks on the north bank of the river and six on the south. Ascending Dragon, Wise Man Springs, Pure Altar, Congregated Immortals, etc. The most famous of these, a glimpse of its uh, augurs safe passage and good luck, is the storied Goddess Peak, which takes its name from a smallish rock formation that from the river nearly a thousand that from the river nearly 1,000 feet below resembles the standing figure of a robbed woman, bent slightly forward as in sorrow or in benediction. In a land where stories, historical, legendary, or frankly fantastic, cluster about much more ordinary phenomena, one may well imagine that the elaborate myths surrounding the supernatural woman. One of these myths tells how she and her 11 sisters, only slightly less beautiful and able than she, came to the earth to help great Yu, the great tamer, drain the Chinese earth and make it habitable for ordinary humans. How the 11 sisters became 11 peaks for Witch's Gorge, and how she herself remained in petrified but otherwise human form as a sentinel on the 12th peak to help rivermen safely through this still dangerous passage. Next chapter or next section is this one's about the Hsi Gorge. So I'll begin. It says the Hsi the third and the longest of the gorges, almost 30 miles, is incomprehensible. Is impressive enough in its own right, but scenically it is overshadowed by its companions. Traditionally, it was the most feared of all. While each gorge had its peculiar perils, the ceiling was notorious for its shoals and rapids, formed by periodic landslides as the river cut through the shaly and unstable layers of Huangling anticline. Not far into his ceiling, one encountered Hasin Tan, or New Rapids, which took its name from slides in the south in the 16th century that created this hazard. Three successive rapids, head rapid, first rapid, and second rapid, covering a mile and a half of the river, were so difficult for large upbound junks during low river that they were often compelled to offload and portage their cargoes while the boats themselves were towed through by an extra gangs of trackers, perhaps 100 or more joining the 30 or 40 regular trackers embarked on the junk itself. Taken on from a couple of local villages, the mainstays of which where income earned by tracking and by salvaging of flotsam from wrecks, Head Rapids was by far the worst of the three. Downbound New Rapids was as dangerous as it was arduous in the other direction, as it was as sorry at its worst. The winter low water season, the current ran at 13 to 14 knots across the total fall until the channel was improved in the 1950s of nearly 250 feet. In order to maintain steerage, junks had to exceed the velocity of the current by rowing otherwise. They were simply drifting out of control in the current, so that they entered the rapids at perhaps 16 or 17 knots. If they missed the proper openings to the rapids, they were almost certain to suffer damage, perhaps destruction. In new rapids, as elsewhere, accounts tell us tell of junks virtually exploding in collisions with rocks and teak beams, planking and cargo flying in all directions. During the 1950s, New Rapids was dredged out and the name was changed to Green Rapids. Landslides into the river still continue, however. In 1780s, in, seven, in 1896, a slide estimated at 700 by 400 yards fell out of the north bank to form New Dragon Rapids, which for some months nearly blocked the river. In 1984, another large section of the North Bank near Yellow Ox also gave way. At about the midpoint of the Husiling lay the worst part of the Long River Rapids, the feared Cooling Shoal. Once again, Cornell Plant describes the scene in author's advice as follows. An immense mass of black rock, some 50 feet high at low level, sticks up right in midstream, which surrounded by a number of smaller ones during low levels render the passage on the other hand impassable, leaving only the other which is studded with submerged rocks, the channel between them being very narrow, crooked, and dangerous. There are local Chinese who pilot boats up and down these narrows during low level season. Their services should always be engaged, especially when on the downward passage an error of judgment in making the narrow fairway between the submerged pearl rocks means destruction. Continue. In addition to Ling itself, junks had to avoid Pearl, second Pearl, and third Pearl, and also Monk's Rock, Chicken Wings, and the seductively named but deadly Come to Me Rock. In the illustration on page 34 and 36 and 37, we see these representations of Kuling Shoal, the first from a Chinese source of around 1890, a two-perspective rendition as through one where looking left and right from a boat on the river itself with commentary above the horizons. The second from Plant's Shipmaster Guide, published in 1920, and the third a sketch from Barber's Geological Survey, which channel north or south to take through Cooling depended the water level. Indeed, from Chungking on down the Three Gorges to Yichang, water level determined the degree of danger in any particular stretch, and at extremes of high and low water, whether or not the river was navigable at all. Summer is high water season, with the highest levels usually achieved in July or August. And winter is the low season, uh, which is much more dangerous than high water, expecting flood stage because it exposes the worst hazards the water can present. So I'll show you the pictures. The picture. Okay. This text says, "A view of Kuling Rapids from the 19th century Chinese illustration." Here's another view of the Kuling Rapids. Sorry, there's text going different directions. Um, this is a pretty picture. I don't know how much of it you're going to be able to read, but cool. Okay, next page. And then at the end of this page, I'll have another picture. And then I guess that's probably the end of the chapter, almost. Um, the flow through the gorges, with its peculiar and often menacing whirlpools, eddies, and cross currents, it's influenced not only by water level, also significant is the widely varying water depths in the three gorges. From rapid breaking of the surface to more than 350 feet, This variation comes from the underlying ridges and troughs, anticlines and synclines, across which the river runs, as through it as though we're running across the rows on a sheet of corrugated roofing. When this variation is added to the difference of 200 feet from low water to high water in the most constricted channels, one begins to have some sense of the hydraulic effects that may be created. Barber describes some of them as follows. Anyone acquainted with the river is familiar with the striking alterations in characters which the currents undergo as the water level changes. Besides the running and stationary whirlpools, boiling water, and the other hydraulic features, there are peculiarities in the behavior of silt and gravel banks that merit attention. This may lead to a sudden washout. The silt, which virtually forms a moving body of quicksand, so dangerous that boats tie up to the bank when the sands are on the move. Paradoxically, the force of the main current sometimes produces eddies along the bank that flow in the opposite direction upstream. Um, I'll finish the paragraph and then go back to this picture. For a considerable distance at velocities of 2 or 3 knots, this can produce the very peculiar sight of two junks headed in opposite directions, each borne by its own favoring current. So, this is the picture. Um, and I'll read the text for this one. Just looks like a boat going down the Sealing Gorge. It says a stretch of the cooling rapids accompanying George Barber's geological survey in the 1930s. Now we're at the end of the chapter. This section is called Marking Water Levels. If the river was so mercurial, it was important that boatmen know what water level lay ahead. Marking above mean water level were easy enough. To paint or inscribe in such markings are often seen just upstream or downstream from critical passages in addition. Beautiful written beautiful written calligraphy inscriptions which had been cut into prominent rocks or cliff faces in order to memorialize historical sites, famous personages, or scenic beauty can also be used as reference by noting water levels on the Chinese characters of the inscription. Low water was harder to mark, since obviously it could only be done when the water was low, and very low water occurred only about once a decade in the later winter. The most remarkable of the low water hydrologic stations on the Long River was located at Fuling, about a third of the distance downstream between Chungking and the gorges. Here on the gentle sloping sandstone bar called White Crane Ridge, representations of fish, which were carved into the rock, are at various periods to serve as reference markers. The most recent dating from 1685. Two carp facing upstream, one with a lotus sprig in its mouth. The eye of the fish were the 0 point, associated with the 14 presentable I'm sorry, the 14 presently visible fish are 163 inscriptions, totaling in excess of 30,000 Chinese characters, many of which contain valuable information. Quite apart from the water level observations, which typically took the form, water level is below the fish X feet, and then the date. A 10th century historical text reports that in 763 AD, in the middle of the Tang Dynasty, unusually low water levels at White Crane Ridge exposed a carved fish, which the local inhabitants took as the harbinger of a good harvest. This fish, cut into the rocks at some unknown earlier date, no longer ex- no longer exists, but its mention testifies to the development of regular navigation in the upper Long River, which is the only reason why low water observations would be wanted, since low water is a peril only to shipping and does not threaten onshore activities as high water may. All up and down the Long River between Chungking and Yiqiang, and on major tributaries are water level markers dating from the 1,000 years between the early years of the Sung Dynasty and the end of the 19th century. The large number of high water marking stations above the gorges suggests that flooding may well have been common in Sichuan, than more common in Sichuan than in farther downstream in the Three Gorges themselves. Only in Hsi Ling are there many such markers a fact that we can now understand. The rapids and shoals, characteristic of a sea-ling gorge, require more attention to water than in the case of the other two, and hydrologic data would also be useful farther downstream where the breadth of the river and the very low terrain makes such markers harder to establish and maintain. We will return to the Three Gorges as to the rest of the Long River when we look more closely at migration and navigation, commerce and history, at the flow of at the flow of people, products, and human experience along this great artery. So, what will we read next? We'll read Social Time. So, this is the second part of the book. I guess we're done with reading about geology. So, if you didn't like that, you have this part to look forward to. I guess we're gonna. It says a historical and regional renaissance. I'm gonna check my phone, get a sip of water. That's all. Check some notifications. Um, okay. Um, I'm gonna call it here. Okay, cool. I'm done checking notifications. Um, the poet Tu Fu, writing at a time of devastating rebellion and dynastic crisis, 1,200 years ago, said the following lines to the paper: "The state is shattered. The mountain and rivers remain." Chinese through the ages have often contrasted man's ephemeral efforts with the seeming permanence of nature. Excuse me. It is a land that the Chinese have known from time immemorial. Most evidence points to the conclusion that indigenous human evolution eventually produced Chinese culture and the Chinese people as we know them in historical times. Other people and other influences drifted in during Paleolithic or Neolithic times. Outside influence continued throughout the historical time, and Aboriginal non-Chinese cultures also played their part. But what we call the Chinese people and the Chinese culture seem to have developed in the area we call China. Thus, the whole of the Chinese civilization has been enacted on the single vast geographical stage. Even in very early, even very early in their history, the Chinese were conscious of having occupied this land from time out of mind. A greater contrast with Americans' migrants to the New World could hardly be imagined. A glance at a world map will show that until the age of modern communications, China was relatively remote from other centers of high culture, unlike the situation in the classical Mediterranean world, where quite different cultures were in constant contact and conflict with one another. To the east lay the trackless expanse of the Pacific. To the north, the steppes and the deserts of Mongolia, giving way to Siberia, the nearly impenetrable uh, Tibetan plateau blocked access from the west, while the jungles and the mountains of the southwest cut off the avenue. Only in the northwest was there a narrow corridor out of China, which then divided to follow the string of oases along the foot of either the northern Tian Shan or the southern Kunlun mountains. Thence over the Pamir Mountains to the Middle East, finally to Europe, these routes came to be known collectively as the Silk Road, across which this precious fabric was caravan to the Roman Empire. This was also the path along which Buddhism was carried from India to China, beginning in the first century of our era. More than 1,000 years later, Marco Polo made the same journey on his way to the court of the Mongol Emperor Kublai Khan. Uh, it was this northwestern corridor, not the sea coast, that the Chinese traditionally considered their front door. Although China was by no means totally isolated from the outside influences, um, Chinese civilization tended to develop and was so perceived by the Chinese indigenously rather than out of interaction. Sorry. Although China was by no means totally isolated from outside influences, Chinese civilization tended to develop and was so perceived by the Chinese indigenously, rather than out of interaction with other equally developed cultures elsewhere. As the Chinese looked about themselves at the nomadic people to the north at Korea, Japan, Vietnam, they were convinced that China was the middle kingdom, superior, self-sufficient. The I'm sorry, yeah, that was correct. Superior, self-sufficient. The giver of civilization and its highest value. This conviction was neither surprising nor altogether unreasonable. Like the white races in North America, the Chinese spread out over a continent, assimilating, driving out, or killing most of the people who stood in their way. But the Chinese conquest began in a past so distant that it only now that it is only now being constructed with the help of an archaeological explosion rivaling that of the Mediterranean world, which began about a century ago. Within the single vast geographical stage, layers of remembered time lie like geological strata on the land. This is hardly in any place in China that does not There is hardly any place in China that does not carry deep historical associations. Remains of some sort, memories, our conception of Western civilization involves the idea of movement. To retrace our heritage, we travel to Egypt, Greece, and Rome, the Holy Land, Italy, France, and England. We remember the brutalities of the slave trade and Black Americans seek their roots in Africa. From the Chinese, it all happened here. It was once thought that the Chinese culture had its origins in a nuclear area in the north and spread out from there. More specifically, we believe that a distinctive cluster of traits developed among the Neolithic inhabitants of the Wei River Valley in the vicinity of the modern city of Xi'an and the farther east on the North China Plain. These traits included settled, intensive agriculture, domestication of animals, the high developments of ceramic and later bronze technology, strong kinship um, systems with the beginnings of ancestor worship, elaborate burial customs, and religious practices relying heavily on shamanism and divination. The culmination of these were traits was to be found in the Shang dynasty, roughly 1500 to 1000 BC, of which the two most familiar artifacts are its magnificent bronze and oracle bones, shoulder blades of animals, and the carapaces of tortoises under for use for divination, upon which were incised the earliest examples of the Chinese written language. According to the nuclear area theory, these traits were spread by conquest, assimilation, migration, and simply diffusion or imitation. In this way, early Chinese culture gradually spread and became conscious of its differences from other cultural constellations, especially these based on herding of animals. Meanwhile, of course, these traits were interacting with those of the people being encountered, gradually evolving toward those features we recognize as historic China. The great archaeological explosion of recent decades is showing this theory to be badly flawed. Indeed, so much new and striking material comparable to importance to the discovery at Troy, Mycenaean, and Knossos is coming to light in such pell-mell fashion that no one can fully comprehend it, let alone yet fashion a new definitive explanation of Chinese origin. Nevertheless, some things seem clear. Instead of a single core area of distinctive Proto Chinese culture, we now perceive a rich and untidy complexity. We begin to appreciate how much the early evolution of Chinese culture was an amalgam of various and disparate elements from different regions of what we would now call China. It appears that there were many centers, each with distinctive traits but sharing many other characteristics, rather than expansions of single core. Through the Wei River Valley and in the North China Plain, may have predominated. It says, though the Wei River Valley in the North China Plain may have been predominated, it was growing together, and in the it was the growing together and the interaction of these nuclei that shaped the development of early China. This concept is important to our story of the Long River because it changes our notion of what was central and what was peripheral in the important in the valleys and plains of central China. Along the Long River were several important centers of early civilization. From these centers came, for example, rice and silk, two products that we think of as inseparable from Chinese culture. If these stories had been recorded, inhabitants of the cultural areas known as Chu and Wu might have claimed that they represent the finest flowering of a new civilization. There is an irony here. The Chinese were produced who produced China's earliest coherent written records during the first millennium BC themselves affirmed with pride that their belief that they, the men of the Wei Valley in the North China Plain, members of the culture complex they called Hua, alone represent high culture. All the rest, they believed, barbarians, and early very early, a whole range of cultural stereotypes grew up. Thus, our 20th century acceptance of the core area theory was rested in part on the notion of men who lived 2,500 years ago. For these men of Hua, Chu, and Wu were southern frontier regions. For these men of Hua, Chu, Wu were southern frontier regions toward which they felt a strong mixture of distaste, fear, attraction. Some of these images, mingled with and overlaid by others, have persisted to the present. Edward Schaeffer tells the story of Hua nobleman Su Ma Niu, exiled in 481 BC for some offense of the Yangtze Delta region. The South was a frequent place of exile for outcast Northerners among people generically called Man, who probably spoke tongues related to Thai or to Burmese and Tibetan. Doubtless, Su Ma Yu endured some agony in spirit as he left his. Sorry, I'm now beginning to say the story written by Edward Schaeffer. So I'll continue. Doubtless, Su Ma Yu endured some agony of spirit as he left his friends in the north to take up his life among the unknown strangers to the southeast. To him, as a Human, I'm sorry, as a Hua man, the the Middle Kingdom was a beacon of civilization to the benighted heathen who inhabited the shadowy realms of both the North and the South. Haughty minds of the early Hua men also envisioned the savage rice cultivators of the subtropical valleys as reptilian, slithering nasty on the dark southern frontier. A book already old in Suma Yu's time, characterizing the inhabitants of the central Yangtze basin uh, as follows: How they ride, the man in Qing, playing the rival to our great domain. And then the book continues. Yet, at the same time, it was a richly diverse landscape into which Suma Yu rode, very different from the monotonous yellow plains of the old country, strangely and fearfully attractive to him. This youthful land would become a realm of romance for his decadence, the home of rainbow goddesses, ecstatic priestesses, and lotus gathering girls. In the ancient book conceded that the Southerners were rivals to our great domain. One often encounters this strange and fearful attraction in the Analects. Confucius sounds like a modern parent inveighing against inveighing against rock and roll. Beware the songs of Chu, for they are licentious. I mean, sorry. And the greatest historians of early China, Su Ma Qian, characterized the region 3 centuries after Su Yu's exile as follows: a large territory sparsely populated where people eat rice, drink fish soup, where land is tilled with fire and hoe, and with water, where people collect fruits and shellfish for food, where people enjoy self-sufficiency without commerce. The place is fertile and suffers no famine or hunger. Hence, the people are lazy and poor, and do not bother to accumulate wealth. In the southern direction, there was no environmental boundary to stop the slow steepage of the Chinese and their way of life. The lowlands and the river basins were were well suited to intensive agriculture and to the development of towns and cities. And along these routes, the Chinese gradually advanced. It comes as a surprise to realize that in the far southwestern provinces of Queichao and Yunnan, this process is not yet quite finished, as the Han people continue to fill in what land is left, and the boundary between China uh, to the north and Vietnam, Laos, and Thailand and Burma to the south is thus more an accident of recent political history than a geographical reality. The term Han refers to ethnically Chinese people that's distant from the than the non-Chinese minorities, of which there are more than 50 in China. The term derives from the name of the first long-lived Chinese dynasty, which extended from the about 206 BC to 220 AD. Today, Han people do comprise about 95% of the total Chinese population. It is otherwise in the North China. It is otherwise in the north. North China is dry, enough to make intensive agriculture precarious. Farther north, toward Manchuria, Mongolia, and Central Asia, rainfall becomes increasingly scant. Growing season is shorter. Finally, agriculture of any sort becomes impossible, except in oases at the feet of mountain ranges, and human life can be supported only by seasonal movement of animal herds across steppe grasslands. Sheep with some goats also, where the animals most frequently herded. Camels were bred for caravanning, and larger numbers of horses were raised to be ridden in work and war. Cattle were less often raised because they could not easily be driven over long distances as elsewhere in the world. The nomadic cycles were well established seasonal movements along known routes, not unsystematic searches for water and pasture. The Mongol herder and the Chinese peasant of the inner Asian frontier thus correspond to the cattle rancher and the sod busting farmer on the Western American frontier. Each playing its version of a perennial struggle between open spaces and parceled land. But the herder and the farmer, when they were not fighting, also depended upon each other. The Mongol herder needed the manufactures and the luxuries of the South, which his own mobility and lack of resources made impossible to produce. Grain was also needed to supplement meat, milk, and cheese in the diet. Conversely, the Chinese depended on the pastoralists, pastoralists for more than for their horses, mules, and other draft animals. Wool, leather, and felt were other products that moved south, so sometimes did fighting skill and tactics of the mounted war. Thus, along the inner Asian frontier of China lies a transitional zone across which Chinese ways became increasingly difficult and ultimately impossible to maintain. This frontier zone was historically and remains today the ragged edge of Chinese culture and society today. Within this ill-defined zone, people are hodgepodged together: Chinese, Tibetans, Mongols, Uyghurs, Salars, Kazakhs, and others with all their linguistic and Chinese and cultural diversities. Viewed from this environmental perspective, the Great Wall, completed in the 3rd century BC by the founder of the first unified imperial regime in China's history, the Qin dynasty, from which the very name China derives, can be seen as an attempt to impose a clear-cut and defensible boundary between what was inside and what was outside of China. In other words, the first emperor of of Qin, sought to overcome through an act of human will and enormous cruel investments of human labor, the natural ambiguity of a transitional zone. Beyond the Great Wall, beyond this frontier zone, Chinese political and military power could reach if it were strong enough, but Chinese populations could not migrate there and still remain Chinese. Conversely, when Chinese outposts were weakly held, fierce mounted raiders could gallop south to prey on the farmers in rich cities of China proper. If the Chinese were unable to expel them, they might stay to exploit, perhaps even to rule rather than simply loot and depart. In contrast to the ever-expanding southern frontier, there where more sporadic were much where more sporadic violence occurred, but whence came no threats to Chinese rule in the larger sense. The northern frontier was always unstable, and there was always the dangerous possibility that nomadic people might form powerful leagues or coalitions. Such comings together had often happened and could take place with great rapidity. Given a charismatic leader and the right circumstances along the frontier and in the Chinese heartlands, the ebb and flow of power the across the inner Asian frontier is one of the great dramatic themes of Chinese history, indeed of world history. Although we think of China as having been a unified realm from early times to the present, this is a distorted view, at least from a political perspective. For a long period of time, China was fragmented, and partly or wholly under the rule of aliens from the beyond the Great Wall. Even during the more powerful and unified China of Chinese dynasties, control over the border marches was often shaky or worse. A long look at accompanying chronology reveals that nearly 500 years after 500 years of early empire, um, there followed almost 4 centuries of fragmentation, when the north was lost in a welter of barbarian regimes and a succession of genteel but not very powerful Chinese states held on in the lower Yangtze Valley. The decline in the fall of the Han bears an eerie similarity to the roughly cont- contemporaneous decline and fall of Rome. Similarity is so striking that Arnold Toynbee used it as evidence for a general theory on the rise and fall of civilization. Both Rome and China saw the influx of powerful and ruthless northern barbarians. The fall of Rome and of the Han dynasty seemed to herald the end of civilization, as previously known, and these two collapses were not only political and military, but also religious and moral. Sorry. Where was I? The fall of Rome and of the Han dynasty seemed to herald the end of civilization as previously known, and these two collapses were not only political and military, but also religious and moral crises. Um, Rome was a Christian. Rome was Christianized. China turned to Buddhism. In, atten- in attenuated and altered ways, Byzantium maintained the traditions of the Roman Empire. The southern dynasties performed a somewhat similar function in China. Unlike Europe, where the Holy Roman Empire was but a faint echo of Rome's glory, China's medieval period was one of the most powerful and resplendent eras of her history. Once again, a short unifying dynasty. Uh, the Sui was followed by a powerful and long-lived inheritor, the Tang. In many ways, the Tang was even more glorious an era than the Han had been. But after roughly 2 centuries, its luster was rapidly dimming. By the end of the the frontier marches were virtually independent, and the succeeding Sung dynasty was never able to solve its border problem. In the 12th century, frontier defense collapsed. North China fell once again in the hands of barbarians, this time from the region we today call Manchuria. And once again, a refugee Chinese regime, the Southern Sung, was driven south to the lower Yangtze, the lands of Chu and Wu, where it made its temporary capital in the lovely city of Hangzhou. After the Southern Sung, the late empire, there were interregna, but never again a long period of disunity. Ironically, however, this unity was twice imposed by non Chinese people from beyond the wall, the Mongols of Genghis Khan and Kublai Khan, to whose court came Marco Polo and then the last dynasty, and in some ways, the culmination of the imperial process, the Manchu Qing dynasty, uh, which occupied the Dragon Throne from 1644 until 1911, when in the when in one history's greatest when in when, in one of history's greatest not with a bang anticlimaxes, the abdication of a 6-year-old boy emperor ended not only that but all not that sorry that dynasty but all dynasties, and more than 2,000 years of imperial history came to an end. These two alien dynasties, the Yuan and the Qing, were the were the only two periods of foreign rule over all of China. This very brief chronological survey introduces the names of the principal dynastic periods in provinces and provides a reference chart, since I will be moving back and forth in time through most of the essays in this book. Periods of disunity also influence the story directly, since it was under the impact of the barbarian onslaughts that Chinese influence was pushed into the Yangtze Valley more rapidly and forcibly than would otherwise have been the case. Indeed, during the 3.5 centuries between Han and Tang, refugee populations and exile dynasties so developed the lower basins of the Long River, and that by the time of the Sui Tang unifications, this region had replaced the North China Plain as the economic center and grain basket of China. A similar developmental pulsation took place along the southern Sung dynasty, approximately 1100 AD to 1300 AD, when the north was lost to the Qin before both were overwhelmed by the Mongol hordes of Genghis Khan and his grandson Kublai. Okay, so this is the chart that they were talking about. I'm sorry if you can't read it. Uh, I don't really know of a way for me to explain this chart. It's like a timeline, so hopefully that's helpful in some way. There are plenty of charts online that will show the different dynasties. Okay, so there's 2 pages left, and then I'm going to stop for the day. So um, this last section of this chapter is titled Space. If historical time is marked by the rise and fall of dynasties, historical space is shaped by the large regions into which China is more or less naturally divided by mountains, rivers, and other geographical realities. We saw some of the beginnings of this regionalism in the exile of Su Ma Niu to the exotic and menacing lands of the lower Long River. Then the southern frontier. By the time of the Tang Dynasty, the southern frontier had receded to the Yunque and Lingnan regions. Most of the Yangtze Valley was well into the process of domestication to Chinese populations in Chinese ways. By the late empire, particularly the two last dynasties, the Ming and the Qing dynasties, covering together 5.5 centuries, one could consider with some clarity 8 large regions. Each of these regions, larger than all but the largest of our state, of course, contained many distinctive smaller regions within it, but was nevertheless oriented toward a regional core, more heavily populated, more prosperous, and more developed in general than the increasingly peripheral areas around it. In most regions, the core were related to river systems. In these river basins and valleys, one finds plains and bottomlands more extensive and fertile than anywhere in the uplands or mountains of the surrounding terrain. The rivers bring abundant and dependable water for irrigation and other human uses through floods, though floods may threaten and sometimes devastate. In many areas, and certainly throughout the Long River and its tributary systems, rivers offer cheaper and more convenient transport than any other mode. Indeed, we shall see in the next chapter these river systems were major migration routes along which the Chinese people spread and in whose valleys they settled. It is thus no accident that China's largest cities have always been located in the regional cores, mostly near the important rivers, as is the case, of course, in many other societies. The regions differ greatly among themselves in almost every way: climate, endowment, resource endowment, size, population, prosperity. Jiangnan, south of the river, that rich, varied, and lovely lower Yangtze region contained Hangzhou and Suzhou, is no is no more similar to the Yangtze Plateau of the far southwest than the Mississippi Delta is similar to Arizona and New Mexico. Because the regions are characterized by complex economies of their own, their cycles of prosperity or decline may differ from those of other regions. But the three very large macro regions making up the basin of the Long River among the most important in all of China are strung together more closely than any other because of the river that flows through them. One might reasonably suppose that China's provincial boundaries would flow through the natural geographic realities defined that define these macro regions. To some extent, they do, but the fit is too imperfect to permit simple correspondence, just as is the case with the state boundaries of the U.S. Chinese provinces are as much the result of administrative conveniences, political accidents, horse trading, and local traditions, as are the state of the United as are the states of the United States. Furthermore, the macroregions are too large to be governed by single administrative units. The 8 macroregions cover the area of 18 provinces. It is not unusual that, therefore, to find provincial boundaries cross-cutting or subdividing natural geographic zones. Major cities, however, almost always important administrative centers with lesser cities and towns playing their roles as regional or county seats. Occasionally, here too, there are misfits where a smaller and economically less important city occupies a higher place in the administrative scheme of things. But this is less common in China than in the United States, where many states have deliberately chosen a capital that is not economically the most important city to prevent the city from also having um, dominant political power. For example, Albany versus New York, Springfield and Chicago. When this happens, as it does only rarely in China, it is because of accidents of geography and history, not because of deliberate policy. We can envision then the patterning of space to late imperial China from two perspectives, understanding that the two overlap and interact in important ways. The first is the natural pattern imposed by geography, resources, trade, and accumulated effects of a myriad daily or seasonal decisions of millions of people for long stretches of time. This pattern seems to grow from the bottom up, following a natural common sense and manifested in actual behavior. The second is a top-down administrative and political pattern, self-consciously imposed in which each locale occupies a discrete place. Influences growing out of one system permeate the other, but by no means always harmoniously. As we shall see, for example, in chapter 11, when we consider the important developmental projects that have profound economic and regional consequences and are at the same time controversial political and administrative issues, especially the stupendous Three Gorge Dam and plans to divert the Yangtze water hundreds of miles to the North China Plain to Tianjin and Peking. Regional and provincial interests come into conflict as often as they cooperate. That's why I'll call it quits. Um, I kind of like the section about geography more. I've basically read all this stuff about history. It's good to read it again. Of course, it cements it into your brain. But yeah, it felt like just stating generalities to me. I didn't need that. But the bit about choosing, provincial capitals um, being so different than how they do it in America was interesting. Um, while it's in my mind, talk about the history of shifting dynasties. The story about the man, I forget his name, going to south of the river and living with this Su Ma Qian was interesting. Says, doubtless Su Ma Qian endured some agony of spirit as he left his friends in the north to take up his life among the unknown strangers to the southeast, To him, as Hua Man, the Middle Kingdom was a beacon of civilization to the benighted heathen who inhabited the shadowy realms of both the north and the south. The haughty minds of the early Hua men also envisioned the savage rice cultivators of subtropical valleys as reptilian slithering nastily on the dark southern frontier. A book already old in Suma News time, characterizing the inhabitants of the central Yangtze basin as writhed man, but they rival the domain of the Chinese. So that was interesting, and if I read it before, I didn't remember it, so it's good. But it's just kind of boring to me. Anywho, thanks for watching. I'll let you go.